So hello and welcome everybody to the presentation of the Serbian month in Great Britain. Maybe you're not aware of this manifestation, which is now 13th year running every February, presenting Serbian culture and heritage primarily to the British audiences, but not only to the British audiences. It's also worldwide, and this manifestation also helps Serbian community to connect better and work together better. We are pleased that the virtual Serbian month, which is first of this type, went really well, and we are coming to the end of it. But all events are recorded, including this one, and is displayed on the YouTube channel, Serbian Month. So you are very welcome to have a look at what we had up to now, and you will be able to rewatch this particular lecture also. So it is a YouTube channel, Serbian Month. Our guest today is Dragana Lazarević. She is going to present the topic Palaeologian Renaissance and all that, or how to steal a history. Dr. Dragana Lazarević holds a PhD from School of History, Archaeology and Religion at Cardiff University, and she is specializing in the politics of heritage. Dragana also holds a Master of Science in Conservation of Historic Buildings from the University of Bath and in Structural Engineering from the University of Belgrade. Apart of that, Dragana has over 10 years experience in media. She was working as editor of the first online magazine in Serbia in '98 and also worked in Radio Belgrade and edited the Serbian language radio program in Switzerland for some time and interviewed most of Serbian political elites between '98 and 2002. For many years, Dragana has been researching the models of construction of the national narratives through the usage of material heritage in disputed territories. The choice of topic was influenced by the latest announcement from the political leaders in Pristina about their plans to submit a new application for the UNESCO membership. Unsurprisingly, this announcement coincided with the conclusion of the US House Foreign Affairs Committee members, who concluded that the time for Serbia to recognize Kosovo as an independent state has finally come. The process of the Serbianization of the most important Serbian medieval art and architecture situated in Kosovo and Metohija began almost immediately following the occupation of the province in June '99, and ever since they're under the continuous threat of destruction. So more about that, we will hear from Dragana. And Dragana, over to you, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you today. I wanted to express my gratitude to the Serbian Council for allowing me to present this burning topic in Serbian public life. I know that this event was announced as Dragana Lazarević and the guests, and indeed I have attempted to contact the hegumen of the monastery of Dečani, which we are going to talk about later, but unfortunately it was impossible to establish an internet link of the sufficient quality. So I'm afraid you will have to listen to me today only. Before I start, I wanted to remind you of one specific day in the recent Serbian and Balkan history, and that date is the 17th of March 2004. And I would ask you to let us see a video which caused all the problem with heritage that ensued afterwards. we have seen on this video some of the sites that we are going to talk about today. Immediately after these events took place in Kosovo in 2004, four of the most representative monuments of the Serbian heritage in Kosovo in Metohija is put on the list of World Heritage in Danger. Now, current list of the World Heritage in Danger contains 53 sites worldwide, and one of those sites are those four Serbian medieval monasteries that we are going to talk about today. However, these four monuments, we see which of them they are on the screen, they're not inscribed on the UNESCO list as Serbian, but they are presented as the high point of Byzantine Romanesque ecclesiastical culture, containing the fresco paintings of the new so-called Palaeologian Renaissance style, combining the influences of the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine and the Western Romanesque tradition, which played a decisive role in subsequent Balkan art. The monuments were inscribed on the list immediately after these attacks that we just saw. And 10 years later, in 2015, the self-proclaimed Independent Republic of Kosovo failed to win the necessary number of votes at the General Conference of UNESCO in Paris, following a membership application. The then Albanian Prime Minister of Kosovo and Metohija, Isa Mustafa, bitterly commented that the outcome of the vote was a direct result of the racist campaign against Kosovo, which was continuously maintained by Serbia. The then Serbian Foreign Minister, Ivica Dačić, carefully stated that the Serbian victory came in a very unfavorable political situation in which the whole state found itself since the early 1990s. The narrow win of only 3 votes in favor of the justified concern expressed by the Serbian argument were met with disbelief on both Serbian and Albanian delegations, and it also alarmed both the Albanians and their supporters amongst Western political elites, which built their common case on the presumption of Serbian aggression over the Albanian population throughout the history. Now, this was not a novel approach to the Balkan political framework by the West. By presenting Serbia and its culture as genocidal and openly hostile towards its neighbors since the beginning of the wars in former Yugoslavia, the Western political elites initiated a justification for the policies of interventionism and, as a byproduct, de-Serbianization of the Serbian historic lands. For these purposes, the key Western states engaged a significant number of academics and journalists and artists to write, publish, and promote new versions of local history with aim to single out Serbia as a unique rogue state, which was responsible for the outbreak of the war. Heavily relying on incomplete or deliberately distorted evidence to support their argument, some of the most eminent British scholars produced several books which became influential worldwide, primarily owing to the widespread usage of the English language in the literature, rather than they were some proper academic effort. Before I continue story about Kosovo, I just want to make a small introduction that this revisionism began during the Bosnian campaign. Namely, in 1994, Noel Malcolm, a British historian working as a journalist for The Spectator and the Daily Telegraph at the time, wrote a new history of Bosnia, which departed from the standard textbooks that existed until then. The book, Bosnia, A Short History, was widely publicized as a brilliant work of history, which set the terrible war in the Balkans in its full historical context. This sentence alone set the course of the revisionism. Malcolm himself acknowledged that he never visited Sarajevo or its libraries and archives, And he's nevertheless produced a very eloquent and well-referenced account but this account was based predominantly on the late 19th and early 20th century Austro-Hungarian materials written during their expansion in the Balkans. But he also used a number of the 20th century Croat emigre historians who were close to the Nazi regime of the Second World War independent state of Croatia. The Bosnia, A Short History, as a book, set the course for the subsequent revisionism of the Balkan history in the English language literature and British scholarship. And a number of students since then have been taught history based on the premises promoted in this book. The same author, Noel Malcolm, in 1998, a year before the NATO intervention took place, produced a second book titled Kosovo, A Short History, in which he applied the same research methods used in the book on Bosnia. And by doing so, Malcolm created this revisionist narrative since followed by the majority of the Western studies of the region. Both Malcolm's books introduced the argument of medieval Serbian expansionism over the non-Serbian territories, which are unsurprisingly now inhabited by the predominantly Muslim population. These claims that he put in the book were further developed into the narrative that the Serbs, since the beginning of their independence in the early 19th century, deliberately targeted those nations and their heritage in all territories they attempted to conquer from the earliest days of their national history. As far as Kosovo and Metohija are concerned, Malcolm formulated a postulate according to which the pagan medieval Serbs only occupied Kosovo, inhabited by the Albanians in the late 12th century. And this is the starting point with which Kosovo argues their application for the membership in the UNESCO. These assertions were furthered by a number of authors and scholars who followed in Malcolm's footsteps. And some of them were, for example, James Pettifer or Miranda Vickers, who passionately argued that the Serbian destruction of the ancient monuments, mosques and houses in order to commit a culture-cide of the Albanian ethnicity had to be rightfully punished by the international community. Needless to say, the Albanian scholars in both Albania and in Kosovo and Metohija welcomed those arguments and incorporated them into their own new national narratives. However, this revisionist approach to the interpretation of Serbian history and heritage was lacking material evidence which would be able to support it. In Kosovo and Metohija, there are no primary sources which refer to the presence of the Albanian population in any significant number prior to the late 19th century. Similarly, archaeologically, the evidence there, material evidence, which can be clearly connected to the Albanian ethnicity, is no earlier than the 18th century, and even then it displays almost exclusively Islamic religious affiliation. So this inconsistency between the newly formed narratives about the Albanian presence in Kosovo and Metohija prior to the Serbian occupation, as they call it, in the late 12th century, and the absence of the material remains in situ needed a new explanation. So, building on this initial premises from the Western scholars, Albanian professor of archaeology in Pristina, in the Faculty of Archaeology in Pristina, Dr. Nasser Feri, quite seriously argued in March 2003, and it's significant to mention, March 2003, just a year before March 2004, that Serbian history and their acts have shown that the Serbs were and still are one of the most destructive people in the world, who during their migration from the Carpathians and occupation of the Balkans destroyed everything where they stepped. One of the few things the Serbs accepted without destroying was Orthodox Christianity. After they accepted it, a long period began in which they embezzled sacred Albanian objects and adopted them for the needs of their own Serb church. And today, Professor Neric continues, the traces of this assimilation are evident in ancient churches throughout Kosovo. Professor continues that there is information that even the Patriarchate of Peć, the Dečani Monastery, Gračanica Monastery, St. Marko Monastery, churches in Koriš and Lipjan, and many other famous Serbian, under the quotation marks as he puts it, churches were constructed precisely on the foundation of earlier autochthonous churches. Now, I gave you this long quotation to give you just an idea of how Serbian medieval monuments have been presented to the Western audiences, to the world, and to the Albanians in Kosovo and Metohija itself. Now, these claims of Serbian destruction and imposition of Serbian church upon the autochthonous churches was used to imply further that it was the disappearance of the autochthonous churches which enabled a quick conversion to the Albanians to Islam in the centuries following the Ottoman conquest. In this way, lack of the material evidence of the Albanian presence in Kosovo and Metohija is clear from questioning the cause for this latest war that took place 20 years ago. However, when the burning of the churches in 2004, which we have just seen in this video, when it shocked the population of the West, the whole concept of presenting the Serbs as the main villains in the Balkan wars was brought into doubt. So a new explanation was needed, and that is the Albanians actually do care for the Serbian heritage, and that they are actually very European because they still maintain Christian values despite being Muslims. And this is why the front page of the UNESCO World Heritage List in danger no longer displays the national name of the Serbian medieval monuments. It is these monuments are denoted on the World Heritage List as Byzantine Romanesque. Now, the experts of the UNESCO and ICOMOS who produced the documents for the UNESCO list could not really, to be fair, could not really completely avoid mentioning the Nemanjić kings who built those monuments. However, terms such as Raška School or Vardar School of Architecture, which were used in the academic classification and academic literature for the past 120 years, are barely mentioned. Raška School only twice in a document of nearly 400 pages. Of all of the four most representative monuments that entered the list were built by the Nemanjić dynasty, as I said, but they're all significantly different in their architectural features. For example, the monastery of Dečani, and I think we can see it on the slide, so the monastery of Dečani is the last and most splendid represent of the Raška school. And indeed, it is a unique fusion of Romanesque and Byzantine influences which flourished in the Serbian kingdom between 1170s and 1330s. The monastery of Gračanica and the Church of Holy Virgin of Ljeviš in Prizren belonged to the Vardar school, which was a 14th century fashionable style modeled exclusively on the Byzantine architecture. And finally, the Patriarchate of Peć is a complex of churches which represents a fusion of both Raška and Vardar styles, and it was built over the period of 7 decades. The argument here is that those 4 monuments clearly do not have similarities and thus cannot be put in the same Byzantine Romanesque category. So let us begin with the monastery of Deceni. The monastery of Deceni is built as the mausoleum of King Stefan Decensky, who was actually nicknamed by his endowment. As so many other Raška-style monuments, it was modeled on Studenica, which is the mausoleum of Stefan Nemanja, the founder of the dynasty. Situated in the Raška River Valley, hence the name of the style, around 190 kilometers north of the current Kosovo and Metohija border, Studenica was a blueprint for all other royal tombs of the Nemanjić kings. Perhaps it is worth mentioning here that all of them were buried in the monasteries and churches built in this style. So it is true that Raška style successfully blended the Romanesque, Roman Catholic, and Byzantine Orthodox building techniques. Romanesque architecture is evident in the base of the church, and on that aerial photograph we can see that the base is in the shape of an elongated Latin cross. And another Roman Catholic influence is visible in the exquisite stonework. So the Byzantine Orthodox influences, on the other hand, are visible in the choice of a dome and internal fresco paintings. Now, the Nemanjić kings were well aware of Serbian political position between the East and the West, and each and one of them built for himself a mausoleum modeled on Studenica. Just to mention here, Stefan Nemanja himself was baptized a Catholic at birth. It is worth mentioning here that Studenica is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1986. And quite interestingly, on the World Heritage list on the webpage, it's presented as belonging clearly as the Raška School of Architecture. Now, perhaps I don't see very well, but I would say that Deceni resembles Studenica in more than one aspect. So why is Studenica categorized as Raška school monument and Deceni as Byzantine Romanesque on the World Heritage list? I have not heard a satisfactory answer to that yet. No other medieval Orthodox ecclesiastical structure ever incorporated elements of Catholic building traditions, and no monuments of such characteristics appear anywhere else in the Byzantine world. Such building practice never reached the imperial capital, Constantinople. When Studenica was founded and erected between 1186 and 1196, the Byzantine Empire was ruled by the emperors of the Komneni dynasty. So there is no term Palaeologian anywhere near coming yet. And when it was built, the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist for well over half a century. And by the time of the construction of Deceni, the Raška style flourished in the territory covered by the Serbian domain, Serbian kingdom. which then covered the Morava Valley, Metohija, Kosovo, Montenegro, and extended further west to Bosnia and Herzegovina and Dalmatia. And now this Byzantine Romanesque designation business becomes even more complicated when we look at the monuments which belong to the Vardar style, beginning in the vicinity of the then Serbian capital Skopje, the current capital of the North Macedonia. It spread along the Vardar River in northern Macedonia and westwards to Kosovo and Metohija at the very beginning of the 14th century. The main promoter of the style was King Stefan Uroš II, Milutin, whose long reign of nearly 40 years was marked by the introduction of the Byzantine court ethics. Both the Gračanica and the Virgin of Ljeviš were paid for by King Milutin, who acquired this Byzantine cultural framework in order to secure peace with Byzantium. Milutin vowed to build one church for each year of his reign, and it seems likely that he had kept his promise, at least in part, because the number of churches and monasteries that he had founded and reconstructed by far surpasses the number of endowments left by other Nemanjić kings. His choice of Byzantine architectural traditions was guided both by his aesthetic preferences, of course, but also by his political and economic decisions. Namely, in order to be able to pay for these numerous construction projects, simultaneously, the king opted for a cheaper version. So he was supporting rebuilding or reconstruction of the churches and monasteries that were erected by the Byzantines in the previous centuries, before that part of the Slav populated Balkans became part of the Serbian crown possessions. The Virgin of Ljeviš, as the first one, represents, of course, a firm departure from the building traditions of the Raška style, because its base is the shorter Orthodox cross plan, and it has this harmonious usage of horizontal layers of bricks and stones on the facade walls. So this choice of the layered walls had not only structural but also decorative role, which does not appear in the Raška monuments. Raška monuments were usually covered in marble. So putting the accent on the facade as a whole, the need for carved stonework had faded. So the fresco paintings were something that was doing the whole narrative. The complex of the Patriarchate of Peć consists of 4 surviving dome churches built over the period of 7 decades. The complex suffered many damages and changes over the centuries, but what survives clearly indicates that they were built in a combined Raška and Vardar styles, which corresponds well with the periods in which they were built, because the oldest church within the complex is modeled on the older monastery of Žiča in central Serbia, which is also Raška style monument, and the first seat of the Serbian archbishopric following the independence from Constantinople in 1217. So clearly, the two styles are very different and have only one thing in common: their commissioners, the Nemanjić kings. The experts of the World Heritage Center maintain that these 4 14th century monuments are all covered by the Palaeologian Renaissance frescoes, which further removes the notion that they were commissioned by the Serbian kings. So what is this Palaeologian Renaissance? The Western art historians were the first to define this term, and initially they referred to it as the revival of Orthodox Byzantine culture and art after the Paleolog dynasty retrieved the empire from the Latin rule in 1261. within the Western academia, the term was widely used for depicting the last period of Byzantine history as a cultural renaissance, which spread from Constantinople towards other Orthodox kingdoms founded on the old Byzantine domains. So that's the term which initially defined art in general, has now quickly become deployed in describing the architecture and fresco paintings in the territory of the former Serbian medieval kingdom. But is the Palaeologian Renaissance a correct term? I think not. There is no doubt that the Palaeologs attempted to restore the empire. However, these last 2 centuries of the Byzantine Empire were marked by constant warfare and economic impoverishment. Those Western historians whose subject of research is the latter Byzantine Empire often refer to the Palaeolog period as, and that the Palaeolog emperors as paupers in their own house. For them, building and restoration works which were done in the territory directly controlled by the Palaeolog administration were modest. So Cyril Mango, a renowned Oxford historian of Byzantium, says that many of the churches were little more than empty shells, and even the imperial palace of Blachernae was crumbling. Within the territories controlled by the Palaeologs, the architectural styles followed traditional Byzantine models, but on a much smaller and modest scale in comparison to the monuments belonging to the previous Byzantine epochs. And as such, they were in a sharp contrast with the lavish and exquisite building program of the Nemanjić kings, and particularly they had nothing to do with the Raška style monuments, which clearly predate the Palaeolog period of Byzantium. On the other hand, the Vardar style appeared within the Nemanjić kingdom, which incorporated the northern Macedonia, and occurred at the same time when the Palaeologs recovered Byzantium. Since Vardar style monuments in Macedonia and Kosovo and Metohija surpass in opulence similar monuments found in Greece and elsewhere in the Palaeolog domains due to the rich expenditure of the Nemanjić kings, the question remains who had influenced who. In reality, yes, many of the Greek painters were working on the fresco paintings, but were they painting them in the glory of the Palaeologs or the Nemanjić? I would say the latter. So, unrelated to this whole problem of heritage in Kosovo and Metohija, another British art historian, Dr. Robin Cormack, discussed the term Palaeologian Renaissance more than 20 years ago as imprecise and unclear. He maintains that the word Renaissance was always associated with the revival of classical art and architecture in the 15th and the 16th century Italian states, and as such should not be reassessed. And because it incorporates a much wider definition of art, it should really not be used lightly and easily. So to try to connect our story today, we have to go back to that doomsday of the 17th of March in 2004. The heavy damage that these pictures of destruction did to the Albanian cause alerted the Western supporters of the independent Kosovo. So this is why they made one extra step in presenting the Albanian Muslims, who were clearly angry at Serbian Christian monuments. So they had to present them as caring of the Christian heritage. So after removing national denominations from the Serbian heritage by hiding it behind terms Byzantine Romanesque and Palaeologian Renaissance, a new argument was put forward, and that of the Albanian crypto-Catholicism. Unsurprisingly, the notion of Christian values among the predominantly Muslim Albanians in Kosovo and Metohija came not from the Albanians themselves, but from the Western scholars. And the term itself was invented by an American scholar, Ana Di Lelio, who plainly argued that the Albanians are actually crypto-Catholics who only feign to be Muslim. And this is a direct quote from her book, Kosovo, Battle and Albanian Myth. She was arguing heavily in favor of the decisions to have the NATO campaign against Serbia and the subsequent independence of Kosovo in the terms that in the 1990s, when Kosovo started to aspire to independence, there was an open discussion on converting en masse to Catholicism the fate of ancestors in order to correct the error of mass conversion to Islam. This statement can actually mean something to the audience in the West and to the media that presents the problems of Kosovo in one way, but is actually, in my opinion, quite offensive towards the Albanians themselves, because using the terminology such as correcting the error of conversion to Islam is actually quite insulting for the Albanians, I should think. Clearly, no such arguments came from the Albanian scholars, but they were, the Albanian political elite in Kosovo and Metohija, that is, they were ordered, they were directed to reinterpret this claim in the light of the existing material heritage, so they could lay a claim on the territory itself. So, beginning with Malcolm's initial assertion of the Serbian occupation of Kosovo and Metohija in the 12th century, the notion of destruction of these autochthonous churches and their Palaeologian artistic features, they have began a new campaign in a way to show to Europe that they actually belong to the European cultural framework. So in 2005, a year following the attacks on the heritage, the Pristina political leadership approved a project for constructing a new Catholic cathedral, the Cathedral of Mother Teresa, the largest in the Balkans, despite the fact that over 90% of the population is Muslim. And that is the final slide for today. Its erection, the erection of the cathedral, aimed to show that the new Kosovo was actually part of the European culture. The cynicism of this enterprise is that the choice of the facade, which is clearly identical to that of the Romanesque features of the Dečani monastery. And interestingly, this brings us back to Malcolm, who asserted that Raška-style monuments were imposed on the Albanians in Kosovo, and that the Nemanjić churches were initially provincial in comparison with those in Byzantium. So to summarize this whole speech today, because I don't want to hold it too long, the new narrative surrounding the heritage of the so-called independent Kosovo evolved from the initial premise of the Serbian occupation of the 12th century, which imposed the alien Serbian culture over the Albanian land with intent to commit culturicide, and that it had to be punished. And when years of repeating such arguments initiated destruction, seen at the beginning of this conversation today, they were met with disapproval from the decent part of the world. And then the narrative got a sudden U-turn in which the Serbian occupation meant that the Serbs took over the Albanian culture and embezzled their heritage as Serbian. Simultaneously, unrelated to the political argument of Kosovo and Metohija, the art historians among themselves classified the Serbian medieval monuments as provincial Byzantine, when they were associating them with their ethnic origins, or splendid Palaeologian, when the Serbian name is being removed from description. And finally, this crypto-Catholic cloak is added, a new added layer, as a means to hide the growing Islamic tendencies in Kosovo and Metohija and elsewhere in the Balkans. But it has to be used as the justification of the Western support for an independent Kosovo. But that is an altogether a new story, and I would thank you for listening to me today.
Dragana, thank you very much. For many of us, even being Serbs, this is like an eye-opener, really, to know what is really happening behind. So I have feeling that we are losing the battle unless we do something like this event today and do something about it from our side. I would like to see if somebody has some questions, because there are not many of us here. You could just raise your hand, and it will be probably easier to talk in person and discuss this topic. I have to say also that Dragana has been almost single fighter in the front lines, and was confronted with lots of grief from other side, questioning her presentations all the time. And this is why it's even more important that people like you have support behind to get the information out from our side. So I'm really pleased that we managed to organize this event today, which is recorded, so we'll be able to get further the word, but needs to be done much more.
I was going to ask about the history of the labeling of these structures. I mean, UNESCO has been around for a while, and before the wars of the 90s and the Satanization of the Serbs, how were these monasteries described in those days? How was the what was the reference stylistically, and at what point did it change to the new references?
First and foremost, the terminology, the classification of the Serbian medieval monuments was not done by the Serbian scholars. It was actually done 120 years ago in the midst of the Pigs' War by the French art historian Gabriel Millet. And he himself actually assessed it as very separate architecture from the one seen in Byzantium. And his students and later professors at the University of Belgrade actually adopted this classification, and it has been used in the literature ever since. However, during this vote in 2015, Professor Darko Tanasković, the then UNESCO ambassador of Serbia, said, and he clearly repeated that on several of his media appearances, that they were all aware that the classification which has been done now is inaccurate. But this was the only way to put these monuments on the list in order to save them. So the Serbian scholars are well aware that this classification is not correct, but they just had to first protect the monuments themselves. Now, Palaeologian Renaissance, just like the term Byzantium, was defined by the Western scholars who started researching Byzantium in the 19th century. And it penetrated the academia, and is, as I said, it was used widely for a much bigger cultural framework. And all these revisionists that are trying now to steal the monuments in Kosovo and Metohija were actually just redeploying the term, giving it a more narrow meaning. So effectively, they're using a technical definition and present it as an architectural style. So this is quite a new thing, that these monuments. This is why I was doing this comparison between Studenica and Dečani. So how can Studenica, which was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1986, when there was no war, to be nicely stated as belonging to the Raška style of architecture, and Dečani, which were built, you know, just 100 years or so later, are termed differently.
Might it be a time for those Serbian scholars to say, well, we appreciate that these buildings are now on the list of to be protected, but we do notice an inadvertent new tendency has crept in. We would rather that UNESCO kept to its original labeling in that way, to make the point that there was an original labeling and that it has been changed. I mean, although they needed to accept the new terminology in order to have these monasteries put on the list to be protected, there's no reason why they should stay silent now and allow that to continue. They can very politely point out that there's been an inadvertent change of terminology. That's maybe something they should consider. Perhaps we should tell them to consider.
I agree with you, but that is not the question. I completely agree with you, but that is not something that you or I can solve. So this has to be done from the top of the Serbian state, because they really need to engage the experts on these matters and start actually doing, you know, this correction.
Yes, it is only that we are waiting government to do something about it. But as Marko said, maybe we should take initiative. And if people from outside of government start to do something and point these errors, that's the start. That goes together with one comment that we received from Spomenka from Serbia. Želim da zahvalim doktorski Dragani na ovoj izuzetnoj prezentaciji koja je i upozoravajuća i potresna. Nadam se da je ovo samo početak i da ćete biti još sličnih prezentacija. Pozdrav iz Srbije. For the English audience, the lady is thankful to Dragana for this presentation, and which is very moving, and she hopes that will be just beginning. Exactly what I was trying to point out, that if you start somewhere, obviously you started much earlier than all of us, but somehow being single soldier, it's harder, but you need obviously army behind you. And I hope that Serbian community from Britain and further on can push this subject a little bit further, much further, not a little bit further altogether.
Well, if I can just say and add that the danger of de-Serbianizing these monuments is just the first step, because if we let it, for example, another generation for these monuments to be labeled as Byzantine Romanesque or being done in the Palaeologian Renaissance fresco style, within the next generation of scholars and the academic activity of the revised history is very, very alive and well, and is flourishing actually, and especially in Britain. Within a generation, we will have them relabeled as the Albanian Christian heritage.
That is exactly what is happening in other parts, also like changing history in the books of the curriculum, so the schools about the First World War. And we had many discussions on that topic when we've been celebrating 100 years, commemorating actually 100 years of World War. So the topic is much, much wider on that. Maya Atkinson has a question.
I would just like to say the Turks had land registers for all the territories in the Balkans for tax reasons, and these record the population, and there are hardly any Albanians on that territory. and that's for hundreds of years. I don't know how. I'm not a historian. I just can't understand how people can put plausible arguments about history with ignoring the, hundreds of years which have been recorded. Nothing to do with self. It's simply evidence. And I don't know. I've seen since the breakup of Yugoslavia how every nationalist group had a history written a la carte. Norman Stone wrote the history of Croatia for Tudjman. I mean, I just don't know how these people can be credible if they are so selective in what happens. People are generally rather ignorant, and I probably wouldn't know anything about it if it was Iran or something. But as it was my country, I was just shocked and appalled at how these things can be done. So I'm terribly grateful to Dragana for giving this presentation, and I just hope that more people in sort of personal integrity reasons, if nothing else, can actually look at facts and not just accept anything that is shown, which changes on a daily basis to fit in with the interest of big power. So thank you, Dragana, and good luck with your work.
I know what you're referring to, the defters, the first Turkish defters, referring to the census and the population in Kosovo and Metohija are, I think the earliest are from 1455, and they record well over 98% of the Serbian, that is Slav population. So you're asking and you're questioning how come that these people are credible, but easily, as I said, as I mentioned, it started with Noel Malcolm, and he himself was probably charged with this task to revise the history in a way that would enable the British public receive an information in which Britain is supporting a just cause, and the just cause would be only if we present Serbs as the occupiers and the Albanians as victims. When I said Malcolm wrote a well-referenced account, he actually used documents produced by the Austro-Hungarian historians from the late 19th century, in which they presented the story quite differently. But that's an altogether a different story. And if we look the whole process of revisionism that took place since the 1990s, if you look at them separately to the individual student of the region, they may look credible. But when you put them as a mosaic, one next to each other, you will see a lot of discrepancies between themselves, even though they're all arguing Albanian cause. So I'll just give you a simple example. One of them is that Albanians maintain that they were always the majority in Kosovo and Metohija, that they were only occupied by the Serbs. And to keep this storyline, they say, with the help, for example, from another British historian, Frederick Ascombe, who is currently, I think, at the Birkbeck College, who says that big migrations, great migrations that took place following the Habsburg Ottoman War of the 1690s, that never took place. And on the other hand, those historians who argue the Croat point of view say that the Serbs became majority in Slavonia, that is part of Croatia now, only after they came from this big migration. So who is right, Mr. Ascombe or Mr. Banac? And so if you put them all together, you will see that a lot of them are actually have no logic.
I had a question for Dragana. It's I have actually two questions. First, Dragana, thank you for this great presentation. And the second one is, I come from very different areas that have nothing with human studies or history. And I use a lot of logics in my work, mathematical logic. And sometimes I can find a way of that logic into the law, but not further than that. So I'm interested, is it possible to do something like putting an presentation or website that has more of this data in depth, that starts with major facts like this timeline that doesn't come together, and then puts this presentation like of that Catholic influence on this first Serbian church, and comparison with what is done in Byzantium, and what they call this Palaeological Renaissance. Can we see that in the light of comparing one thing to the other, one next to another, and create a presentation that goes bit deeper into that with the facts? Because even then, I don't think that they will believe whatever we say. But I don't believe we should stop the fight. And I also believe that the first fight for us is how to influence our politicians to move them in this direction, to fight these things, or anything if it is possible for us. I don't know how much time we have. We have the country here to actually rebuild, because economically, and maybe that's the basis for anything we can do in the future. But maybe we will be too late to get on this field where all of our history is put under and propaganda glasses and shown in that way. So my question, there are two questions. Is there something we can do to really have this, to prove, like the lawyer will prove these things, these discrepancies that they create, and put them in one place together? And another one is, anybody has any idea how do they do it in the West? How we can maybe influence our politicians here in Serbia to do more in this area?
The first question, it's all the matter of logistics. If you don't have the infrastructure and the people to do the job for you, it is incredibly hard to create something overwhelmingly large. And I agree with you, whatever we say. I mean, I know that following this presentation, I'll probably be labeled as a Serbian nationalist, but I did not use a single Serbian scholar in quoting and doing this presentation. I was just showing to some, some illogical comments that come from the mainly British, because we are in Britain, historians, but everything is replicated elsewhere in those Western states that support Albanian cause. Logistics, this whole business of revisionism has to do with the politics and the geopolitics that is. So British political elites, they don't care whether those monuments are Serbian or Albanian. For them, it is important that they have territory which is going to be compliant with their political goals. And in this instance, it's the Albanian national narrative that is compliant with what the British say, so they are going to support it. And for that purpose, they have started with those two books that I mentioned at the very beginning, and then they were easily incorporated into the narrative about the region because they simply awarded Mr. Malcolm with a professorship at Cambridge, and then he had a number of students who were taught this distorted version of history, and then it was spread worldwide. I have come across many colleagues during my PhD research who based the complete argument of what was happening now on what was written in those books. And this is something that was disseminated widely amongst the university communities, in the media. This is something that is carefully maintained for the past 25 years. But no student of the region can do the overwhelming and a big oversight of what is happening. So this is why somebody who is researching the Middle Ages will not be entirely aware of how this argument is misused in when they're talking about modern history. That's number one. Number two is if we can do anything. Unfortunately, there was very little that we could do during the 90s, and I'm quite sure that all of you have heard of this term cancel culture. What I want to say with that, I want to say that those scholars who were supporting the Serbian cause throughout the 1990s were very frequently excluded from the academic community if they wanted to argue the case against those that were presented so far.
Has time changed? Because I'm connecting this with a few books that we promoted this Serbian month, and the problem of publishing those books was a very big problem in let's say a few years behind, but now they managed to find the publishers. Is it this period of 20 years or how long since the black cloud around us changing, because history is now coming up again? Is it this right time to do something about it, or still not yet?
It is. We are one day too late always in every aspect. So previously, most of Serbian scholars were not allowed to present openly these arguments that I was presenting today, for many reasons. You know, many of them have their families to feed, so if they don't want to lose jobs, they will simply keep their heads down and be quiet and silent. It is the time, and it is always the time, and we need to keep up mentioning and defending our cause, no matter how much, because in the future, when this historic distance takes place, the new researchers in the future will be able to see and hear that this was maybe a dominant view, but there were people who were questioning it even back then. So we have to keep it up going and keep it going, no matter how restricted we are in our endeavors.
We have one more question from Vidan.
Hello, I'm Vidan Bogdanović, historian from Belgrade. I worked also in Kosovo and Metohija. And first, Dragana, thank you for your wonderful presentation. My congratulations.
Thank you.
And also, well, first of all, we have to, I think that in the future, we should underline that our aim, it is not to say this heritage, it is Serbian, because we want to say it is Serbian, like it's ours, it is not yours. It is ours, but that is not the first our aim. It is to save and to conserve this heritage. Someone who destructed this heritage cannot save and conserve this heritage. This heritage, it is Serbian, but it is also of the whole world, because these monasteries and the frescoes are so beautiful that I think everyone in the world, no matter whether he is from Asia, from Russia, everywhere, should see it and should admire it. So if it is like that, only Serbian scholars can find the best way to conserve it, because it is theirs. So I have suggestion that this presentation should be sent to every academies and faculties into Europe, in Russia, and so it is maybe more question for the host. Can we expect in future more presentations like this? And to say to Dragana again, thank you thank you, and I hope that you will continue with this.
Thank you very much, Vidan. Very good suggestion, and obviously we will really carry on. So we have to work together with Dragana and bring more other people, not just Dragana, from all sorts of levels to continue. So obviously this is just beginning, and I will make sure that, and Serbian Council, that we continue with this work. Dr. Rupert, please.
I'd just like to make one comment first, Dragana. Excellent talk. Probably to follow on from here, it'd be good to do maybe something like a Google Earth survey of the sites to understand, are they today damaged? Are they, you know, because that was clearly some serious damage, to make some sort of statistical survey of what's happening to these structures in different territories.
Those surveys have been done, and there is a list of everything that was destroyed, and it was around 152 churches and well over 600 graveyards that were destroyed between June 1999 and March 2004. And this was done obviously by the Serbian heritage institutions, but unfortunately they were dismissed as propaganda. That's number one. Number two, following the occupation in 1999, the NATO administration brought in an American architect to set up the heritage institutions of Kosovo, Mr. Andrew Hercher, and he was actually the one who was also listing what was destroyed, and he was using both the Albanian and the Serbian documents in doing so. However, because his task was to set up the Kosovo heritage institutions, he had to argue along the lines of Serbian occupation and the sort of rightful destruction of these monuments. I mean, admittedly, his book was published before the proper attack took place in 2004. It was published in 2003, I think. But yes, there are monuments and there are lists of everything that was destroyed. But unfortunately, there is this wall of silence which prevents them from penetrating the audience in the West.
I'm just saying it's possible by Google Earth to see a building, whether it's standing or destroyed now, today.
Again, that is the matter of logistics, you know, who can employ the people who can go there, put the cameras and do the works. It is very exciting. As I said, I wanted to invite the hegumen of the monastery of Dečani, the Archimandrite Sava Janjić, but it was impossible to establish the connection because the monastery itself is surrounded by the barbed wire, and the K forces are sort of protecting it and guiding it. So the internet link is very poor. The telephone lines are not frequently functioning properly. So he would have been able to say more about that aspect if he was had he been able to join us today.
Okay, thank you.
We can possibly find way around this and then record it and make some more events. I will have to finish soon, and I want to read the comment from Sarkan. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation by Dr. Dragana. You really did a great job. As an Azerbaijani, I received useful information from your lecture because Serbia was always been in my interest. I hope such lectures will be continued. Thank you very much for comment, and we will definitely continue. And it's nice to see somebody who is not from our
background, yes,
being confronted with similar things happening in that part of the world where Azerbaijan is. Thank you, Dragana, so much. Thank you very much for your questions and for coming today and having time for us. And I'm really pleased that this lecture was part of Serbian month and opened one big topic that even we haven't been aware of in such a big details and such explanation about further steps, because we all know about distractions and about our steps to try to protect it, but obviously that's got much further now. And it's, as you said, it's always time to do it a bit late or not late, but to confront their information is by bringing out different information to the open to the audience. So as somebody has suggested, if we do the work from our side, it's then at least much more balanced. So regardless how long it takes to to get results, but we have to do something about it. Please join us on other events. We have few more events coming up, and on the website of Serbian Council of Great Britain, you have a catalog which talks a lot about Serbian community, and feel free to contact either Dragana directly or just go to our website and send us a message with any ideas. Our email is info@serbiancouncil.org.uk, and we are really keen to continue this conversation better sooner than later again.
And thank you for letting me presenting my work. I hope we have more events like this. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
All the best. Bye-bye.